I first came to Nepal in 1966. That's 2023 सालमा पहिले आएको नेपालमा. And I was in the United States Peace Corps. President Kennedy had started the Peace Corps to recruit Americans to come to countries like Nepal and in Africa and in South America to teach, to do agriculture, to build roads, to work in public health. And I came as a teacher, and in Kathmandu at that time there was only one traffic light on New Road. So because I like Nepal, I have a big book collection on Nepal. I go to the bookstores here, I buy the books, I take them to America, and I put them on the internet and sell them. And I don't do a big business, but I enjoy doing that. So, and I've written this book. It's not on railways, but this is the latest book I wrote based on U.S. State Department records about the early days of Nepal-America relations. And then I also wrote a book on the railways of Nepal. And then I've written two picture books I published two picture books about Nepal, pictures that I took a long time ago. When I was a young boy, my father got me interested in railways in America. When I came to Nepal, I did not pursue the subject of railways because I was busy teaching and it wasn't on my mind. But after I retired, I came back and nobody had really written about the railways. There's it's on the internet, maybe 1 page, 2 pages, but a lot of it's not accurate, not detailed. So because nobody had written about railways, and I came to Nepal and I needed a project, and I like doing research, so in 8 or 9 years ago I began doing research on railways. And I tried to meet people who father had worked for the railways or had ridden the railways. I went to the National Archives here and tried to find documents, which was very difficult to do. I went to Tribune Library. They have it's called the Regmi Research Report. Mahesh Regmi was a prominent economic historian. And he did a business of translating the Nepali newspapers into English and selling those translations to the embassies and to the aid agencies, starting in 1957. So in all those reports, once in a while there was reference to a railway. So I looked through all those records. And then the RSS, the Rashtriya Samachar Samiti, starting in, again, about 1960, they did daily news reports in English and in Nepali. And those reports are at the office there, near Singadarbar. So I went there and I started looking. Every month they had bound volumes. And I went through all of those, looking for information on the railways. And then in the books I have in America, there are references here and there to the railways. So all that information I gathered, and then the other big source was photographs. And I made connection with Europeans, mostly British citizens. They had come, they were railway enthusiasts, railway fans, and they had come in the 1980s and 1990s to ride the Indian steam trains in Bihar and the Darjeeling train, the Simla train, and they had come to Jayanagar. Maybe they had no Nepali visas, excuse me, but they wanted to ride the Nepal Jayanagar train. So they rode the train up to Janakpur, and then they returned. There were no customs, there were no police at the border, and they took photos. And I was able to, they sent me those photos to use in my book. So I have about 400 photos of the railways in this book that I've published in America. The earliest railways were built in the Terai in the 1920s. And the Chandra Shamsher, who was Prime Minister, he gave a contract to Indians to come into Nepal and cut the sal trees. And of course that money then came to the Prime Minister, to the Ranas. They had that land. And so the Indian contractors, they built small railways, portable railways in Kailali district, in Bardia district, and also in Chitwan. And and most of the workers were of course Indians. And they would go in and cut the trees and take them to India for the sleepers, for the rail sleepers. We say ties. In other words, the rails, the leak, or they sleep on the ties. So the Indian railway system was very large then, and they needed these wooden ties. Nowadays, the ties are made of concrete, but So those were the first railways in Nepal. At least 3 that I found records of. There may have been more. And then in 1927, the Nepal Government Railway, it was built by a company in Calcutta. In 1 year, they built that system. And what was the purpose? The purpose was, at that time, there was no good road from Birgunj up to Hitorna, but there was a ropeway. They built the ropeway from Dursing to Matatirtha. And so the goods came on the Indian railways to Raksal, and then they were put on the Nepal Railway, and it ran up to Amlagunj, and then the goods were put on lorries, on trucks. They were taken to Dursing near Bhimferi, and then they came to Kathmandu. Other goods, of course, were carried on people's backs. So that was the purpose of the railway, was to get goods to Kathmandu. That was the main purpose of the Nepal Government Railway. Now the Janakpur Railway was built 10 years later, and at that time, Juda Shamsher, he owned land in the Tarai, north of Janakpur. So they did the same thing. They cut the sal trees and they took it down to Jainagar. But of course, in Janakpur, there's a famous temple, the Janki Mandir, and many hundreds, thousands of Indian pilgrims would come. Ram Niwas, the various festivals. And so those pilgrims started riding the Janakpur train to come from the Indian border to Janakpur. So that train carried passengers and also carried freights. Later on, the Janakpur cigarette factory was built by the Russians, and so that factory imported tobacco, and then they sold, of course, tobacco. They sold their cigarettes to India. So there was some business back and forth. So those were the 2 main railways. There was another couple of railways I could talk about if you're interested. The Kosi Dam that was built. The Indians built a railway from Dharan to Chakragati to Bhimnagar in India, the Kosi Barrage, to bring stones from Dharan down to mix in the cement to build the Kosi Barrage. So that was a railway that existed for about 20 years. The government has a lot of plans to build railways, but there are 3 fundamental issues in my view. Number 1 is, because of the hills in Nepal, a railway the grade cannot be more than about 1%. That means for 100 feet in length, you gain 1 foot in elevation. If it's steeper than that, it's very difficult for a railway. So in the Tarai, that's why the 2 railways were built in the Tarai, because it's flat land. But once you get to the hills, then there's much more of a challenge to build railways. So you have to start building tunnels, you have to build bridges, and so on. So that's one issue. Another issue is the expense, the cost of building railways. Everywhere now, infrastructure in America, in Europe, to build railways, to build bridges, to build roads is getting very expensive. So who's going to pay for the railways? A third issue is there an economic justification for the railway? Now, what I've heard is that the Indian railways, although it's one of the biggest systems in the world and millions of people ride, they're not profitable. They lose money. So that means the government has to subsidize. Now, it makes sense in India because there are not so many private cars and airplane travel is expensive, so millions of people ride the railways. The question is, in Nepal, it'll cost a lot of money to build a railway. And once the railway is in operation, will you collect enough money for cargo and for passengers to meet the expenses? And if you don't, then of course the government is going to have to subsidize. And my understanding is now the new Janakpur Railway is losing money. So that's one question. Is there going to be enough business for the railways? For example, if they build a nice railway, but the tickets are quite expensive, and there's bus service, most of the Nepalis are going to keep riding the buses. They're not going to switch to the railways. So there's an economic analysis that has to be made. The other big problem is the gauge. The gauge means the distance between the rails, and there are many different gauges in the world. In the Tarai, they were 2-foot gauges, means 2 feet between the rails. The narrow gauge was the Nepal Government Railway. It was narrow gauge 2 feet 6 inches. Then there's meter gauge. That's 3 feet 3 inches. That was very popular in India, the meter gauge. Then there's the broad gauge. That's in America, in China, in Europe, is 4 feet 8.5 inches. Then there's broad gauge. Well, and then Russia has a 5-foot gauge, and then there's broad gauge in India, which is 5 foot 6 inches. So you see, if India builds a broad gauge network in Nepal that's 5 feet 6 inches like this, and the Chinese build a standard gauge system, which is 4 feet 8.5 inches, you're going to have incompatible gauges. And that would mean everything coming from China going to India, they would have to unload all the freight and put it on a different train, you see. That's why in America, about 140 years ago, there were a lot of different gauges in America, and the government said there's going to be one gauge. So you can go all the way across the country on one track. And that was a problem in Roxall in the early days. Roxall, the Indian trains were meter gauge, the Nepal government railway was narrow gauge. So everything at Roxall, not the people, but the cargo, had to be transferred. That's inefficient, it takes time, things are broken, things are stolen. So it's not a good system. Well, you see, that's the problem. Who's going to pay for this? Is India going to pay all the costs? Is China going to pay all the costs? I don't know, of course. If Nepal has to take out a loan, how much? What are the terms of the loan? In other words, here we get into the economic considerations. The second issue is, how long is it going to take? It took 8 years to build the railway from Jayanagar to Janikpur. 8 years, that's about 30 kilometers. Technically it can be done, of course it can be done. But the question is, what is the cost? And then again, from China, let's say a railway comes from China. Now I know Nepal is importing a lot of things from China. They're importing a lot of things from India. But what about going back? Are the trains to China, are they going to go back empty? In other words, is Nepal going to be exporting a lot to China, or is Nepal going to be exporting a lot to India? You see, that's a primary consideration. Again, that is the traffic, the cargo, what's going to be the flow. And of course, the consultants do these studies, but I don't know on what basis they do the studies. And maybe they do a study in 2022 last year, but the railway doesn't come into operation for 8 or 10 years, so the situation may have changed. So again, there are a lot of challenges to building these rails. In principle, I'm all in favor of railways. That's why I wrote a book about the railways. But again, Nepal is quite a small country. As I say, the geography, the mountains, the rivers, it's very challenging, expensive to build railways in the hills. In the Terai, it's not so difficult because the land is flat. But of course, they're talking about a railway from east to west across Nepal. Now there's already a highway from across Nepal from east to west. So again, building a railway, is it going to do enough business to pay the costs? And they're talking about electricals. Now that's a good idea because the petrol, the old railways ran on coal that was imported from India or firewood. So now the new railways are going to run on electricity, which is a good idea, assuming that Nepal will have enough electricity, which I think they will. But this is what I just said is, yes, the goods from China could come in, the goods from India can come in, but now if you have different gauges, you see, it's going to be very inefficient and slow to have to reload everything. That's one problem. The other problem is, what is Nepal going to send back to India and China? If there's nothing to send back or very little to send back, then again, it's not going to be economical because you're going to have to pay the costs, right, of the drivers and the locomotives, electricity. But if the trains go back mostly empty, that's a problem. So I hope Nepal will have enough goods, to export to Nepal and to China. Now the transit, as I said, that of course, now that assumes too that India wants to get Chinese goods. Now I know they're getting some now. And that assumes that China wants to get India goods. But as you know, there's political differences between China and India. It could be, but that assumes that China and India want to do that. My understanding now is most of the Chinese goods come by ship, by sea. I'm not an expert on this. And I'm not sure. India and China do a lot of trade, quite a bit of trade now. And of course, not much through Nepal, if any. So they have to agree to see the advantages to use Nepal as a transit point. So that again, that is not in Nepal's hands. Nepal can't control that. They have to assume that India and China will want to do this. So it's possible. But again, my guess is that, well, it's hard to say because if you look at Shanghai, Shanghai is on the sea. So to bring goods from Shanghai all the way across China, across Tibet, and then down to Nepal, versus from Shanghai using a ship to go to Mumbai, oh, I'm sorry, not Mumbai, to Calcutta. See, I don't know the economics. It may be cheaper for, for them to do that way. I don't know that Nepal has studied that. And these cargo, the big cargo shipments in the trailers, like the big trailers, whether those could be easily transported through the Himalayas, through the tunnels, I just don't know that. So it's possible, theoretically it's possible. Whether it's practical is another question. And in terms of rail, the rail service in America, the main is commuter rail. For instance, like from Bhaktapur to Kathmandu, see, or from Doran to Birgunj. They're rail systems for commuters, and then within the cities. But long distance rail, its usage is very low because people prefer airline travel to go quickly. And almost everybody has an automobile in America. And so if you have a family of 4, if you have to buy 4 tickets on the rail, it's going to be much more expensive than driving. So the intercity rail service in America, except between Washington, New York, Boston, that's a popular route. But in the Middle West and western part of America, rail service is not used very much, as I say, except for commuter rail service. Namaste.